A small coal crew dug into a dry hillside near an old railroad track. They lived on beans, hard bread, and hoped to get steady winter pay. The work was normal until their picks broke through into a hidden empty space deep under the hill. They found strange marks in the dust, carvings in light, colored stone, and air that hadn't moved in a very long time. That night, the ground began making tapping sounds from below the floor of their sleeping building. Whatever lived under that hill was not sleeping anymore. Before we continue, please leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I still remember the taste of coal dust on my tongue that winter in 1906. It covered my mouth no matter how much water I drank. We were 30 miles outside a small Nevada camp that doesn't exist anymore. It was a strip of wooden buildings and canvas tents around a narrow railroad track. Men called it Dry Camp No. 3. To me, it was just a row of thin walls that shook in the wind and a bed where my feet stuck out into the cold air. I had come from Utah that fall looking for steady pay. The copper mines had let men go, and I heard that the coal layer under the Nevada hills was thick and close to the top. By the time I got there, crews were already cutting into a low hill of gray stone that rose behind the camp. The company manager, a short man named Briggs with a heavy watch chain, said we would be rich in a year and gone in 2. He always smiled when he said it, but I never saw him go down into the mine tunnels. There were 6 men in my crew. I slept next to a tall Irish man named Connolly. His beard never grew evenly and left light patches on his cheeks. He made rough jokes and hummed while he worked. Next to him slept a Mexican worker named Alvarez. He had worked in silver mines in Virginia City and said this coal smelled strange to him, too dry and sour. There was a young boy we called Sparrow, no more than 16 years old. He lied and said he was 18 so the company would hire him. He had quick hands and wide eyes that tried to look older than they were. The last 2 were brothers from Kansas, Illy and Thomas Ward. They were big and strong in the shoulders, quiet men who smoked cheap tobacco and kept to themselves. Our days were simple at first. We got up before sunrise, ate beans and rough bread in the kitchen building, and walked the narrow track up to the mouth of the main tunnel. A dark opening cut into the hillside, framed by rough wood and piles of leftover rock. The air inside was cold and still. Lamps hung on nails near the entrance, and each of us took one, checked the wick, and lit it before stepping into the tunnel. The light always looked thin in there and stopped quickly against the rock, but it was enough to see the rails and the rough-cut walls. Those first weeks went by in the usual way. We cut coal, loaded carts, and pushed them back to the surface, where the mule team pulled them to the sorting building. There were roof collapses and bad tempers, and the kind of arguments that happen when men work in tight spaces, but nothing worse than what you find in any mine. If anyone talked about stories the Shoshone families told around their winter fires, I didn't hear it. All I knew was that they stayed away from the hill and watched us from far away when they came to trade. It was Alvarez who first talked about hidden spaces in the hill. One evening after dinner, a cold wind came down from the hill and drove most of the men into the sleeping building. The lanterns swung on their hooks and the stove in the center glowed red. Alvarez sat on the edge of his bed with his boots off, rolling his shoulders, and said the coal was not lying right in the hill. He said there were empty spaces behind the coal layer, hollow places that changed the sound of the pick when you struck it. Old rock with holes, he said in his rough English. The hill is not solid. It has many empty places. Connolly laughed and asked what was supposed to have made those holes. Alvarez only shrugged and looked at the floorboards. Sparrow listened with a serious face, the way a boy listens when he wants men to think he's grown. 2 days later, we hit the first pocket. We were 100 yards in by then, following the coal layer downward. The air had gotten warmer and heavy with dampness. My shirt stuck to my back while I swung the pick, and the lamplight shook with every strike. I remember hearing a dull change in the sound, a hollow note, and then my pick broke through into open space. Cold air rushed over my hands, dry and stale from being trapped in the rock for a long time. We all stopped at once. For a moment, there was only the hiss of our lamps and the slow drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then Connolly stepped up beside me, held his lamp near the hole, and looked through. On the other side was darkness, deeper than the tunnel around us. We made the opening bigger by carefully knocking away chunks of coal until a man could squeeze through. Briggs came down not long after we sent Sparrow to get him. He arrived in a clean shirt with a scarf around his neck and a lamp that had never seen coal dust. He looked into the gap, sniffed the air, and asked how far the empty space might go. None of us could say. He rubbed his chin and told us not to stand there guessing. He wanted us to explore the empty space before the next work shift. If it was large, he said, they might put wood supports in it and use it for storage. If it led deeper into the hill, they could dig a new tunnel and open more of the coal layer. The Shoshone interpreter, who sometimes came to camp, must have heard about the discovery. That evening, he stood outside the kitchen building with 2 elders, watching the lamps burn at the tunnel entrance. I saw Briggs talk with him for a short time. They exchanged a few words, and Briggs waved his hand in a sharp motion that ended the talk. The interpreter left without coming in for coffee. When we went to bed that night, the sleeping building felt colder than usual. The wind pushed at the walls and sent fine dust through the cracks. We gathered at first light and walked up the track without much talk. Frost covered the rails and made them shine white in the lamplight. At the mouth of the tunnel, the wooden beams were damp and rough to the touch. We checked our lamps and went in. The air was colder near the entrance and got warmer as we moved downhill. My hands felt tight around the handle of my pick, and I could hear Sparrow breathing behind me, slow and careful. At the pocket we had opened, the cut edge showed hard coal around a black gap. Connolly crouched and held his lamp close. The flame bent toward the empty space, then held steady. He looked back at us and said the air beyond was still. Briggs arrived moments later with a coil of rope and a chalkboard for notes. He told us to keep our heads and follow instructions. He wanted 3 men to go through the opening while the rest made it bigger and kept the line secure. He chose me, Connolly, and Thomas Ward to go first. Alvarez shook his head once, but said nothing when Briggs told him to stay with the support crew. We took off extra layers to avoid snagging on rough edges, slung the rope over our shoulders, and squeezed through. Coal scraped my back and left dust in my mouth. On the other side, I stood in a low room with a floor of packed dirt. The ceiling was close enough that I had to bend over. The beam from my lamp showed the walls reaching away in a curve. The space had a dry smell, old and sour. My breath felt heavier at once. I called back to say we were clear. Connolly and Thomas joined me. We tied the rope to a stub of rock and moved along the wall. The room got wider into an oval shape. In the center stood a tall piece of light, colored stone that didn't match the coal around it. Its surface was smooth and hard with shallow lines cut across it in a pattern I didn't recognize. Thomas ran his fingers over it and said it wasn't natural. We all stepped back without meaning to. The pattern didn't look like writing I knew, and it didn't look like random cracks. I walked around the tall stone and found a narrow hallway leading away at a slight downward angle. The walls there weren't smooth. They showed uneven marks as if many tool edges had worked there for a long time. The edges weren't clean. They had small chips that suggested hard hands and lots of work. My lamp showed small piles of dust under some of the ridges. The floor had shallow dips that formed a trail. The shape wasn't a boot heel and wasn't a hoof. Each dip had a long end and 2 shorter ends that curved. I crouched and touched one with my fingers. The edge was sharp, not old. Connolly called me back to the tall stone. He had found something on the ground near its base. It was a strip of light-colored material that bent without breaking. One side was smooth and dry. The other side had small ridges in a regular pattern. He lifted it and held it near his lamp. The surface caught the light in a dull way. He said it felt like a skin of some kind. Thomas frowned and told him to put it down. Connolly set it on a rock and wiped his hands on his pants. We heard the rest of our crew coming through the opening. Their lamps added more light and threw long shadows across the room. Briggs entered last and walked straight to the tall stone. He ran his hand over the carvings, then stood back and told Sparrow to draw what he saw on the chalkboard. Sparrow's hands shook a little, but he drew the lines carefully. Alvarez stood near the narrow hallway and watched the darkness, his face still. Briggs asked about the marks on the floor. I pointed them out. He crouched and followed them with his eyes to where they turned into the hallway. He told Eli Ward to bring 2 wooden beams and set them at the entrance to hold up the ceiling. Eli went back through the opening with Alvarez to get the wood. While they were gone, we set up a simple anchor for the rope around the tall stone and took a length with us. Briggs wanted the 3 of us and Sparrow to go into the hallway while he and the others made the room bigger and took measurements. We moved single file with me in front. The hallway sloped down and curved right. The walls were close and our shoulders brushed them. The floor had more of the same dips, and in a few spots there were drag marks between them. I stopped and pressed my palm to the groove. It was shallow but straight. Connolly whispered that the air felt warmer. I noticed it then. My lamp burned steadier and my skin felt damp. We came to a fork. The path on the left had a low ceiling and a strong smell, sharp and mineral-like. The path on the right dropped away more steeply and carried a faint current of air that touched my face. I listened and thought I heard a soft clatter somewhere far below. Not loud, more like small stones tapping together in a slow rhythm. Sparrow heard it too. He swallowed and shifted his grip on the chalkboard. We chose the right path because of the moving air. The rope paid out behind us to the room. I marked the wall at the fork with a notch and kept going. After 20 yards, the hallway got wider into another room, smaller than the first. The ceiling rose. The floor had scattered pieces of light-colored material in thin shapes. I knelt and picked one up. It crumbled under my fingers and left a dusty residue. The smell here was stronger, close to the smell near the left path, but not as intense. Connolly's lamp showed dark stains and patches on the floor. They were old and dry. Sparrow pointed to the far wall where narrow vertical grooves ran from floor to shoulder height. The grooves were smooth and evenly spaced. At the base of one groove lay a simple pile of stones, arranged in a ring with black residue in the center. I touched the residue and it smudged my fingertip. The ring wasn't big enough for our kind of fire. It looked more like a spot for heating small things. There were thin bones near it, brittle and hollow. I didn't recognize the animal. We didn't speak for a minute. The soft clatter far below came again, then stopped. I felt the hair rise on my forearms. Sparrow whispered that we should turn back and tell Briggs. I agreed. We marked the room in our notes, scanned the walls again, and went out the way we had come. At the fork, the smell from the left path was stronger than before, and the air felt wetter. I made a new notch and we started back. In the first room, Alvarez and Eli had set the wooden support and were cutting wedges. Briggs stood with Thomas, counting his steps around the tall stone. He looked up when we entered and asked what we found. We told him about the lower room, the stone ring, the grooves in the wall, and the old stains. He asked about the sound. I said it came and went. He nodded and told us we would need to push farther on the next trip. He spoke in an even tone and kept his eyes on the chalkboard. Sparrow's lines came out neat and simple. We worked for 2 more hours holding up the entrance, measuring the main room, and taking note of the carvings. Briggs told us not to spread talk around camp. He said men quit when they don't understand something. He said the company would bring in a proper surveyor soon, and that would settle things. He didn't say when. On our way out, Alvarez bent down and picked up the strip Connolly had found. He sniffed it, held it close to his cheek, and then set it down again. He didn't look at any of us. Outside, the wind had risen, and fine dirt moved across the ground. We walked back to camp with our heads down, lamps covered. That evening, the Shoshone interpreter came again, this time with only one elder. They waited near the kitchen door until Briggs arrived. I stood close enough to hear. The elder spoke in a low voice, and the interpreter translated. He said the hill held old rooms that were better left alone. He said the hunters didn't walk near there in winter, because something moved when the earth slept. Briggs told him the company had work to do. The elder lifted his hand once, palm outward, and then left with the interpreter without taking coffee. Sparrow sat with me in the sleeping building after dinner. He cleaned his lamp glass with a rag and asked if I believed the elder. I told him I didn't know what to believe yet. Connolly pretended not to listen but kept his eyes on us. Alvarez sat on his bed and sharpened his small knife with steady strokes. The Ward brothers played cards with low voices. I woke before sunrise to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't wind or the creak of the walls. It was a dry churring from the direction of the hill, faint but steady. It went on for several breaths and then stopped. No one else moved. I lay still until the stove snapped as the iron cooled. Then I slept again. In the morning, Briggs gave out a new order. He wanted Thomas to lead the next push with me and Connolly behind, Sparrow to record, Alvarez and Ely to carry wooden beams, and the rest to haul waste rock. He carried a small pistol under his coat that I hadn't seen before. He caught me looking and said it was company property. We gathered our gear and went up the track. Inside the hill, the air felt warmer than the day before. Faint dust hung in the lamps and moved in flows. At the fork, we turned right again and followed our marks. The lower room looked the same except for one thing. The ring of stones had been disturbed. A few pieces leaned outward, and the black residue showed a new smear that was darker at the edges. Connolly swore under his breath. Sparrow's pencil paused over the board and then moved again. We stood still for a long moment and listened. The soft clatter rose through the floor, closer than before. It came in pairs with a pause between them. Alvarez took one step toward the far wall and stopped. He had gone pale. He pointed at the floor near the grooves. There, in the dust, a new set of dips crossed over our footprints. They led from the far wall to the hallway and down into the dark. The edges were sharp. The dust had a faint ripple where something had dragged. Briggs told us to hold our positions. He took a knee and looked at the marks without touching them. He stood and said we would go forward a short distance, and then return to report. He chose only me and Thomas to go with him. Connolly told Sparrow to keep drawing. Alvarez backed toward the hallway and set his lamp on a rock for more light. We pulled the rope tight and stepped into the deeper throat of the hill. We moved in slow steps. The hallway narrowed and forced us to turn sideways for a stretch. Our lamps shook a little because we tried not to breathe loud. The air felt heavier the farther we went. It made my chest feel tight. My boots touched loose grit that shifted under my feet and made a dry clicking sound. Briggs kept his hand on his coat where the pistol sat. Thomas held his lamp out in front, arm locked straight. The walls changed texture after we went down 10 more yards. Coal gave way to a darker stone that had thin veins of a gray mineral running in uneven paths. It didn't reflect lamplight. It swallowed it. Past that point, the sound beneath our feet was steady. The same tap pattern with a pause. No change in rhythm, no change in direction. It made me think of something working at a task with patience. We reached another room. This one was tall enough that the lamplight didn't reach the ceiling. The floor was dry. The rock under our boots was smooth and hard. There were piles of broken stone in the corners, each no higher than a man's waist. Some pieces were thin and curved. Others were short and bulky. None were coal. They were too light-colored. There was something in that room that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a feeling of being watched. It was a feeling that we were intruding on ground that was already in use by something that had left only moments before. There were no carved tall stones, no symbols, just a single low-carved ditch in the floor that ran from near the entrance to the opposite wall. The ditch had dried residue along its length. Thomas crouched to look closer and froze in place. Briggs knelt beside him and leaned in. He reached his thumb down and touched the residue. His face went stiff when he lifted it. The residue was red, not faded, not dusty red. He hissed a breath and told us to go back. We didn't argue. We backed out the way we came, careful not to drag the rope. When we returned to the lower room, the others were exactly where we left them. Sparrow held the chalkboard against his chest, eyes wide. Alvarez hadn't moved from the rock where he placed his lamp. Connolly had his pick in both hands like he expected something to rush from the dark. Briggs told everyone to return to the first room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He only spoke in short words and clear orders. He told Sparrow to take the board, and he told Alvarez and Eli to bring the wooden beams. We moved in a single, file line up the hallway. When we reached the first room, Briggs told us to gather around him. He said we would seal the hallway until a survey team arrived. He said we would tell no one outside this crew until the company decided what to say. He said what was inside the lower room was not our concern anymore. The Ward brothers nodded without speaking. Alvarez turned away and wiped coal dust from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Connolly stared at the floor until Briggs told him to look him in the eye and confirm that he understood. When we reached the tunnel mouth, daylight felt strange. It was too bright. The cold air outside felt thin. The hill behind us looked like any other hill, but it now had weight in my mind that it didn't have before. We walked down the track to camp in silence. Men outside looked at us with questions on their faces, but none spoke. Briggs went straight to his office and closed the door. That night, the sleeping building felt tense. Men moved quietly and spoke in low voices. Sparrow lay on his bed and stared up at the rafters. Connolly sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his hands together over and over like someone trying to get something off his skin. Alvarez prayed quietly in Spanish. The Ward brothers smoked and said nothing. I sat on my bed and tried to put the shape of those dips in my mind next to every print I knew of in the natural world. None matched. All I had was uncertainty that settled into a dull ache in my chest. 2 hours after lights out, I woke to the same dry tap sound I heard before sunrise. It was louder now. It came in steady rhythm from the direction of the hill. I stepped outside and saw the other men standing there too, scattered in silence outside their doorways. We all heard it. It wasn't wind or rockfall. It was deliberate. It went on for several minutes, then stopped with no fade out. At dawn, we walked up the track again, but Briggs stopped us at the tunnel mouth. He said the company would stop all underground work until the survey team arrived. The work crews would shift to expanding the sorting building and clearing leftover rock. I saw anger in some of the men who hadn't gone inside the hill. One said we found gold and were hiding it. Another said the Shoshone cursed the hill. Briggs told them to keep their mouths shut and do what they were paid to do. The next 2 days were slow and restless. The tap came every night and sometimes in short bursts during the afternoon. The men who had never gone into the hill grew irritable. Sparrow lost weight fast. Alvarez refused to step foot near the hill. Connolly started drinking early in the morning. The Ward brothers watched the hill from behind the tool shed and said nothing at all. On the third night, the taps came closer. Instead of coming from deep under the hill, the sound seemed to move toward camp. It was still faint, but no longer distant. It carried through the cold air like something steady and patient closing distance. I was outside when it happened. The sky was clear and full of stars. The sound grew loud enough to make men look at each other with a kind of silent agreement that we had crossed a line. We formed a small group near the tool shed. Sparrow stood between me and Connolly. Alvarez stood behind us near the wall. The Ward brothers moved to the front and listened with their hands on their belts. The tap stopped. The silence that followed had weight. Then the sound came again, but this time from under our feet. A single dry scrape close to the tool shed door. A second scrape near the sleeping building foundation. We all stepped back. Briggs came out of his office with the pistol drawn. He didn't shout for men to calm down or return to their beds. He only asked where the sound came from. Thomas pointed at the ground near the shed wall. Briggs raised the pistol and told everyone to stand clear. The ground under the shed gave a single sharp click like stone on bone. Then silence. Briggs lowered the pistol and told everyone to get back inside. He said we would form an armed watch until dawn. He said nothing else. The men obeyed because there was no other thought left to cling to. I sat awake for most of that night with my lamp burning low and my back against the sleeping building wall. My chest hurt every time I breathed in. Sparrow sat on his bed staring at the door. I tried closing my eyes, but the memory of that lower room came back every time. The ditch, the red residue, the new dips in the dust. We were not alone in that hill. That much had become certain. Briggs divided us into pairs for the watch. I was with Connolly. We took the first shift outside near the tool shed. The night air felt dry and sharp, and the stars looked washed out. Our lamp sat on a crate between us. Connolly rested his pick handle across his knees. He whispered that he had worked mines since he was a boy and nothing ever felt like this. He said every mine had its own smell, its own sound, its own mood, but this was something separate from any place men had cut. He said it felt like the hill had its own order, and we had disturbed it. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. We kept watch for 2 hours and heard nothing. There was no wind, no taps, no scrape, just a still quiet that made every breath feel too loud. When our shift ended, the Ward brothers relieved us. I went back inside and tried to sleep again but couldn't. The stove had gone low and the cold sat heavy in the sleeping building. Sparrow hadn't slept at all. He sat with his back against the log wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. At dawn, the cook rang the bell for breakfast, but only half the men came to eat. Some hadn't slept. Some were afraid to step outside. Briggs ordered the miners who hadn't gone inside the hill to continue moving leftover rock. He told our small group to stay near camp and rest until the survey crew arrived. He didn't know when that would be. He only said they were coming from Ely by railroad, but Ely was days away. We stayed near the sleeping building most of that day. No one wanted to go near the tunnel mouth. The men who moved leftover rock cursed under their breath and kept looking toward the hill. The Shoshone elder and the interpreter returned near noon. They stood far from the camp until Briggs approached. I saw Briggs talk with them again. This time, the elder shook his head in a slow way, like someone watching a door close that should never have been opened. He placed a small pouch wrapped in animal hide on the ground and gestured for Briggs to leave it there. Briggs refused. He kicked the pouch aside and walked away. That night, the taps returned, but now they came in uneven bursts. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps, a long silence, 4 taps. Each strike felt carried by intention. We all gathered outside the sleeping building and listened. Briggs stood there too with the pistol in hand. He told us to get inside. We moved fast this time. No one argued. It was after midnight when the first scream jolted every man upright. It came from outside near the sorting building. I ran to the door with Connolly and Sparrow behind me. When we stepped into the cold, we saw Eli Ward running toward camp. His arms flailed and his eyes were wide. His voice broke in his throat as he tried to tell us something. His words made no sense. He kept pointing back toward the hill. Thomas ran to him, grabbed his shoulders, and tried to calm him. But Eli began clawing at his own shirt, then at his throat, as if something inside wouldn't let him speak. He collapsed in front of us and lay still. When I knelt beside him, his chest wasn't moving. His eyes were open and looking straight up. Thomas stared down at his brother and shook in a slow, rigid way. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He put his hand on Eli's chest, left it there, and then looked at Briggs without expression. Briggs told us to carry the body to the tool shed until morning. We placed him on a worktable near the back. Thomas stood outside the door and refused to leave. None of us tried to pull him away. When dawn came, Briggs wanted to bury Eli. Thomas refused. He said we needed to wait for the survey crew so they could see everything. Briggs argued that the Nevada sun could rot a man in days, but Thomas wouldn't give the body up. Briggs finally agreed to leave Eli where he lay. By noon that day, another change took hold in camp. The ground near the tunnel mouth showed new marks, not tracks on the surface. Deep, narrow gouges in the dirt like something sharp had been dragged toward the entrance. The marks weren't wide. They were thin and even. They led right to the tunnel mouth, and then vanished under the wooden beams. Briggs ordered us all to stay back. He had the men who never went inside the hill gather their things and leave on foot toward the nearest railroad camp 20 miles away. The company wouldn't allow it if they found out, but Briggs no longer seemed to care. He told them they wouldn't be paid for the last week, but they didn't argue. They packed and walked away fast without looking back. Our group remained. Me, Connolly, Alvarez, Sparrow, Thomas, Ward, Briggs, 6 men now. We spent the day inside the sleeping building with the windows blocked. The taps began again at dusk and grew louder than any night before. The floorboards creaked from subtle vibration. Sparrow flinched with every strike. Briggs sat at the table with the pistol beside him and never looked away from the door. Near midnight, the sound stopped. The sudden silence made every breath feel dangerous. In the quiet, a new sound came. A faint scrape on wood outside the sleeping building door, then a second scrape. Connolly whispered for us not to move. Briggs raised the pistol. Sparrow gripped my forearm so hard his nails dug into my skin. Something pressed lightly on the door. The wood bent inward, not enough to break, enough to show force. Briggs aimed center mass at the panel. The pressure relaxed. The scrape moved toward the window. The glass made a soft flexing sound like a fingertip sliding across its surface. Thomas whispered his brother's name, not out of hope, out of instinct. He held the knife he had sharpened earlier. The scrape stopped. The hill went dead silent. Then the tuk-tap rhythm began again, but this time it came from the cellar beneath the floor. Briggs fired a single shot straight into the boards beneath him. The sound that rose back up from the cellar was a low rattling exhale that didn't match any human throat. At dawn, the taps ended. The cellar went quiet, no scrape, no pressure on the wood, nothing. When we stepped outside, the ground around the sleeping building showed fresh dips in the dirt, the same shape as the ones in the lower room. Narrow at one end, wider at the other, with shallow ridges on each side. They formed a ring around the sleeping building, spaced evenly in perfect patience. I realized then that we were being measured. We stayed close together that morning. None of us wanted to stand alone for even a few steps. Briggs told us we wouldn't go back inside the hill under any circumstances. He said we would wait for the survey crew, and then leave the moment they arrived. He said they could handle whatever was down there. He tried to sound firm, but his voice was rough. His shirt was untucked and his right hand trembled when he tried to put the pistol back in his coat. Thomas stood by the tool shed with the door open and looked in at his brother's body. The stiff shape on the table felt unreal in daylight. The sun made everything look ordinary again. That bothered me more than the night. The normal light gave us no truth. It only forced us to live alongside what we already understood, but didn't want to say. Sparrow ate nothing. He sat near the sleeping building steps with his back pushed against the wall and his knees pushed up to his chest. He held the chalkboard he used in the room but never looked at it. Alvarez walked the edge of camp in a slow circle, muttering and glancing at the hill every few seconds. Connolly polished the metal end of his pick while sitting on an overturned crate. He didn't speak. He didn't hum anymore. Briggs ordered me to burn the rope we had used inside the rooms. He said anything that touched those spaces should be destroyed. I took the coil outside camp, piled brush, and lit it. The rope shrank and blackened fast. The smell was harsh. When I walked back, Alvarez asked if I felt anything different. I told him no. That wasn't fully honest. I felt a strange pressure inside my skull. Not pain, not fear, something that sat below those things. 2 hours later, while the sun stood high, a long sharp crack came from the direction of the hill. It sounded like a slab of stone snapping under pressure. Then came a low, continuous grind of earth. We all turned toward the tunnel mouth. The wooden beams around the entrance shifted slightly. Dust rose from the cracks and drifted into the air. The ground under our feet shook once with a short jolt. The vibration moved through the soles of our boots and then stopped. Connolly cursed under his breath. Sparrow closed his eyes and lowered his head. Briggs stood still for several seconds, then called all of us to the center of camp. He said if the hill was unstable, it could collapse and take us with it. He said we would move our gear to the far side of camp and wait there. He said nothing about lizard people or monsters or anything unseen. He refused to say the words, maybe because saying them would make them real in a way he couldn't reverse. We moved everything we could carry. We chose a place near the creek where the ground was open and flat. The sun reached it fully, and it felt safer than the shadows near the hill. Thomas wouldn't move his brother's body. He said Eli wouldn't be left alone. Briggs told him to bring the body. Thomas refused, so the body stayed in the tool shed. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Fine dust rose off the hill and blew toward the camp in thin curtains. It carried a faint smell that reminded me of the narrow room beyond the fork. Sharp mineral, like heavy. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, we heard the taps again. This time, they didn't sound from the hill. They sounded from under the tool shed, the same slow rhythm as before. 2 taps, pause. 2 taps, pause. Exactly the same spacing as that first night when it started. Thomas drew his knife and walked toward the shed. I moved to follow him, but Briggs grabbed my coat sleeve and told me to stay put. Thomas never stopped. He walked straight inside. We heard his steps fade on the wood floor. A moment later, a single sharp slam of wood came from inside. Then silence. Briggs raised the pistol and ran toward the shed with Alvarez behind him. Connolly moved in behind them. I reached the doorway as Briggs yanked it open. Thomas was standing inside with both hands clenched around the edge of the worktable. His shoulders rose and fell in shallow movements. His head bowed slightly. His brother lay right where we placed him. No movement, no shift. Nothing changed from the moment we left the body there that morning. Briggs called Thomas's name. No answer. He stepped closer and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. When Thomas looked up, I saw something in his eyes that didn't belong to a man standing in daylight. His pupils were wide. His jaw held tense in a way I had never seen. He whispered that something moved beneath the floor. He said he felt it press against the boards under his feet. The way he said it wasn't frantic. It was flat, like he had accepted it. We backed away and left the shed. We tried to talk Thomas into leaving. He wouldn't. He said he wouldn't abandon Eiley. He sat down near the door of the shed with the knife in his right hand and the body of his brother behind him on the table. Night came with no color in the sky, just a rapid fade to dark. We lit 3 lamps and set them in a triangle around our new camp spot. No one slept. Sparrow sat between Connolly and me with his arms wrapped around himself. Alvarez stayed standing. He refused to sit. Briggs paced, his boots scraped the dirt in tight circles. Around midnight, the taps started again below the shed. Then the taps moved under the ground between the shed and the creek. Not fast, not loud, just closer. Then we heard a second set of taps farther back near the tunnel mouth. Then a third set from farther right near the leftover rock pile. 3 separate patterns moving at once. I felt every muscle in my body tighten at once. Sparrow's breathing turned short and fast. Connolly lowered his pick and rested it against his thigh because his hand shook too much to hold it level. The taps stopped. The silence lasted long enough to make us hopeful for 1 second. Then came a new sound. A solid drag across soil near the creek, slow, long, very close. Briggs lifted the pistol toward the sound. His hand shook. He stepped backward until he stood beside us. The lamps flickered. Then we saw a shape in the darkness at the edge of the light. It crouched low with long limbs pressed close to the ground. Its skin was pale green and dry. Its head was narrow and elongated with flat, dark eyes set far apart. Its mouth opened slowly and showed rows of small, pointed teeth. It didn't produce sound. It only breathed in short, shallow bursts. Behind it rose another shape, then another. We stood frozen. The lamps showed their movements in brief sways of shadow. The nearest one tilted its head in a short mechanical motion. It stepped forward into the outer ring of lamplight. Its skin had a pattern of overlapping ridges down the sides of its torso. Its hands were long and ended in curved black claws. It stood upright now, taller than a man. Its chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. Briggs fired at its face. It didn't fall. It turned toward him with no reaction on its face at all, and then it moved fast, faster than any man could move. It hit Briggs before I could track the movement. 1 second, it stood just inside the ring of lamplight. The next, it crossed the distance with no wasted motion. It struck his arm and sent the pistol out of his hand. The pistol spun in the air and hit the dirt 10 feet away. Briggs cried out and dropped to one knee. The creature's claws left 3 clean vertical cuts through Briggs's coat sleeve. Blood ran down his forearm fast. The creature didn't follow through. It stepped back and watched us. Alvarez shouted that we had to fall back toward the creek. Connolly grabbed Sparrow by the collar and pulled him. I kept my eyes on the creature closest to us. Its dark eyes tracked every movement we made. 2 more shapes moved into view behind it. All 3 formed a slow arc to block the path back toward the hill. They weren't trying to force us back into the mine. They were pushing us farther away from the hill's base, like we had trespassed, and this was their line. Thomas shouted from the shed that there were more under the floor. I couldn't see him through the open doorway, but his voice sounded different. Not panicked. It had a dull certainty. Briggs forced himself to stand and held pressure on his arm. We backed toward the creek slowly. We kept our lamps between us and them. They responded by moving at the same pace, matching every step we took backward. When our boots hit the loose pebbles at the creek edge, the creatures stopped advancing. Their bodies stayed still. Their heads tracked us. The nearest creature raised its shoulders slightly in a small motion and let out a short dry hiss like air forced through narrow cartilage. Another hiss answered from the left, then silence again. Briggs whispered to check the water for deeper crossing. The creek was only knee-high but wide. Crossing in the dark would be dangerous. Alvarez said we didn't have a choice. Sparrow said he couldn't swim well. Connolly told him he would carry him if needed. The creatures stepped backward as a group, not turning their backs. They moved toward the shed and stopped near the door where Thomas still sat. Alvarez started toward him, but Briggs grabbed his shirt and pulled him back. Briggs said Thomas made his choice, and we couldn't pull him out without getting cut down before we reached him. Alvarez yelled that we couldn't leave him in there. Briggs stared at the shed a long moment and said if Thomas was staying, he was lost already. That sentence made Sparrow cry without tears or sound, just air moving out in small bursts. In the lamplight, I could see Alvarez's jaw tremble. Thomas didn't react to our shouts. He sat inside that shed with his brother and the things outside the door. I didn't know if he was waiting to die or if some part of him no longer wanted to leave. The creatures held around the shed in a ring. They weren't rushing. They were waiting. We crossed the creek. Connolly lifted Sparrow on his back and kept his lamp held high. The water was cold and the stones underfoot were slick. My lamp dipped toward the surface, but I steadied it before the flame died. On the other side, we formed a tight cluster and moved deeper into the scrub. The lamp showed low brush and uneven ground. We climbed a small rise and looked back across the creek. The creatures stood at the edge of the water. They didn't cross. They held their positions and kept watching us. Their posture never changed. They never broke the pattern. The shed door shook once from an impact inside, then a second time. After the second, the lamplight flickering off the water showed 2 creatures pushed the door inward with slow, controlled force. They went inside. Thomas never made a sound. We turned away and left that camp for good. We walked toward the railroad track with only lamplight to guide us. The scrub and loose grit made the going slow. Briggs's wound bled through the cloth he tied around it, but he didn't ask us to stop. Every few minutes he looked back toward the hill. But he never brought up returning for Thomas. Alvarez muttered prayers under his breath the entire way. Sparrow clung to Connolly's shirt until his fingers cramped. After 2 hours of walking through rough country, our lamps began to burn low. The light thinned and the flame flickered more often. We found a small wash with higher ground and packed dirt. We decided to rest there until first light. Connolly planted his pick in the dirt and sat with his back against it. Alvarez sat facing the direction we had come. Sparrow curled up on the ground and fell into a shallow sleep out of exhaustion. Briggs tried to sleep but flinched every time the pain in his arm pulsed. My thoughts wouldn't quiet. I couldn't shake the image of those creatures standing in the lamplight. Their stillness, their patience, their deliberate restraint. They could have torn us apart at any moment, but they didn't. They never moved in frenzy. They moved like creatures that had evolved underground with precise efficiency, with physiological confidence in their own advantage, with no fear response tied to violence. Just before dawn, Sparrow jolted awake from a nightmare. He said he saw a long hallway of smooth dark stone and a ditch filled with fresh blood. He said there were hands dragging something across the floor in slow repetition. He didn't describe the hands. He covered his face and said he didn't want to remember more. When daylight finally broke, the world looked flat and dry again. The hill behind us looked like any other western hill with no sign of what lived beneath it. We continued walking toward the railroad track. The sun rose higher. The grit stuck in the crease of my eyes and made them burn. We reached the track by afternoon. The small railroad shack stood there with a hand pump and a short side track. The water tasted metallic, but it was safe enough to drink. Briggs collapsed on the platform and leaned against the wall. He asked Connolly to check his arm. Connolly cut the sleeve away and looked at the wounds. The cuts were clean and deep. The edges were too smooth to be from rock. We waited there until dusk. No survey crew arrived. No one came down the rails. When the sky dimmed, Briggs said we would walk the rails through the night to reach the next camp. He said when we reached the next town, we would report everything exactly as it happened. He said the government could decide what to do, not the mining company, not us. We set off again. Walking the rails felt easier than crossing rough ground. Sparrow walked on the ties because he said it helped keep his balance. Alvarez kept glancing behind us every few miles. Connolly held his pick like a soldier holds a rifle. I walked beside Briggs so he wouldn't stumble from blood loss. 2 hours after dark, we heard a single tap far behind us on the rails. Then silence. No second tap, no rhythm. Just one loud strike traveling along the steel track. Sparrow froze in place. Briggs told us to keep walking. We did. We pushed through dry wind and darkness until we reached lights on the horizon just before dawn. A telegraph office stood at the edge of the next settlement. Briggs went inside and I followed him. He came out 30 minutes later. He said messages were sent to the nearest law office and territorial officials. He said riders would go to get the bodies at dry camp number 3. He said men would be sent to shut the mine permanently. We stayed in that settlement 3 days. During that time, none of us slept well. Sparrow vomited twice a day from nerves. Alvarez refused to enter any building with a cellar. Connolly couldn't stay indoors longer than an hour. Briggs lay in bed feverish and pale. His wound developed a foul smell. A doctor was brought in but said the tissue looked poisoned in a way he couldn't identify. On the 4th morning, Briggs went still. He died before noon. His eyes stayed open. The doctor insisted on sealing his body immediately and burying him before sundown. We didn't argue. That night, a lawman from another district arrived. He questioned all of us separately. We told him every detail. He wrote it all down but didn't look convinced. 3 days later, a telegraph operator told us a message came back from the recovery team that rode out to the old hill. They found the camp, the sleeping buildings, the sorting building, the shed. They didn't find a single body. Not Ely, not Thomas, not Briggs, not any sign of struggle. Every building was empty and clean on the inside. Tool racks were untouched. The tunnel mouth had collapsed under its own weight. The hill was sealed. The ground around the shed showed no dips or drag marks. The operator asked if we had made the entire story up. None of us answered him. I left Nevada that same afternoon and never returned. Sparrow disappeared a year later in Idaho. No one knows what happened to him. Connolly died of pneumonia in 1909. Alvarez lived until 1938 and refused to talk about that winter ever again. I still dream about the lower room, the narrow dips in the dust, the smell of old mineral air, the long smooth ditch carved with purpose. I know what we saw. I know what walked in that hill. And I know they let us leave.